We continue this afternoon with a discussion of the president as a person. In particular, during this session, we will be talking about aspects of the psychological presidency. That is, we will be evaluating the president's background. We will be talking about the relationship between the backgrounds of different presidents and their personality. We'll then talk some about scholarship that deals with the psychological aspect of the presidency. In particular, we'll look at Fred Greenstein's work as well as James David Barber's work and those who have followed up with James David Barber's work. And finally, we'll discuss some critiques that can be made of studying the presidency using a psychological presidency. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with my computer and go to the organized lecture notes. And here we are. The title of this lecture is The President as a Person. And so we begin with a discussion of the background of various presidents. Why background? Because the building blocks of personality are the experiences that we have in life, and therefore the background of various presidents becomes important. As you probably know, presidents are not typical Americans. None of them are. The Constitution requires that they be older, which implies greater maturity. Of the 44 presidents who have served, 25 have been in their 50s. Only 8 have been in their 40s. Theodore Roosevelt was 42. John Kennedy was 43. Clinton was 46. And Barack Obama was 47. 4 of our past presidents were 65 or over upon taking office. Ronald Reagan was 2 weeks shy of being 70. One president was elected in his 70s. And of course, we know who that is. That's Donald J. Trump. Most presidents have been well educated and attorneys. 27 out of the 44 presidents have been attorneys. Since the turn of the century, 9 presidents have been attorneys. 1 a journalist, 1 an engineer, 4 businessmen, 1 actor, 1 military leader, 2 educators, 1 store owner. Of modern presidents, only Harry Truman did not have a college degree in his educational background. So all of our presidents except Truman had a college degree. 25 of the 44 prior presidents had expensive private higher educations. 6 went to Harvard, 3 went to Yale. Presidents have also tended to be from an elite social and economic status. Kennedy came from a wealthy family, as did both of the recent Bushes. Wikipedia has a nice article on the economic status of the different presidents. So we'll go there for just a minute or two. Okay, so here we are at the Wikipedia article listing the presidents by their relative worth. And we can see a list ordered by presidents' relative worth, with Donald J. Trump accordingly being worth about $4.5 billion. The next closest president to Donald J. Trump was George Washington. He had net worth in today's money of $587 million, followed by Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, Andrew Jackson, James Madison, Lyndon Johnson, and so forth. You can see on the poorer end of this graphing, or this table, we see Harry Truman, less than $1 million in net worth. Calvin Coolidge, less than $1 million. The political science Woodrow Wilson, less than $1 million, and so forth. In fact, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 presidents who were relatively speaking for their age, quite underfinanced. Okay, so let's return to our lecture slides. 10 of our presidents have come from the same families. John Adams and John Quincy Adams were father and son. William Henry and Benjamin Harrison were grandfather and grandson. Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt were cousins, second cousins. James Madison and Zachary Taylor had common grandparents. And then finally here we have George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, who were father and son. What is the implication of having 10 out of our 44 presidents having come from the same families? It suggests a sort of elitism related to prior presidents affecting current presidents. And so there is some advantage to having a relative who has been a prior president, obviously from this fact. So just something to think about. A few of our modern presidents came from what we would call poor backgrounds, in particular Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Nixon, Clinton, and Obama, of the modern presidents, came from a poor background, and many others in the 19th century came from a poor background. Here's something I found on the internet relating to presidents who came from poverty. So let's go there just briefly. Looks like my internet is running slow today. There we go. So here are the presidents who came from poor backgrounds. The first one on the list is Andrew Jackson. But note from the prior slide, or the prior list, Andrew Jackson ended up being one of the wealthiest presidents, one of the 10 most wealthy presidents. Martin Van Buren came from poverty. William Henry Harrison, Millard Fillmore, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, U.S. Grant, James Garfield. All of these presidents were born in poverty. Harry Truman, this is the modern era. Harry Truman spent most of his life in financial turmoil, as indicated here, and so he was raised in poverty. Lyndon Johnson was quite poor. Richard Nixon, poor background. Bill Clinton, poor background. Barack Obama, also poor background. So these people didn't come from wealth. And they list here the case of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump obviously came from a wealthy family. He was born into a wealthy family. His father made his fortune building and settling housing for American soldiers and their families during World War II. Trump made a few successful real estate investments in the Manhattan market in the 1980s before transitioning to self-marketing in the 1990s, according to an article in the Christian Science Monitor. Okay, returning to our lecture slides then. Political experience is generally something that's quite common for past members of the presidency, although we note initially here that Donald J. Trump had zero political experience prior to entering the presidency. So let's go to the Wikipedia article on presidents listed by their prior experience. Okay, this one is a little faster. And you can see here some stuff on that extracts common data among presidents. Of the 45 presidencies, Donald Trump and 44 different individuals have served as president. Grover Cleveland was elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. And so of the 44 different people who have or are currently serving as president, 32 presidents had prior military experience. 9 were generals in the Army. 26 presidents were previously lawyers. 18 presidents previously served as representatives, U.S. representatives. 6 of 18 held that office prior to the 4 previous positions shown in this table. 1, James Garfield, was a representative immediately before election as president. 17 presidents have served as governors. 15 were state governors. 9 were governors immediately before election as president. 1, William Howard Taft, served as a territorial governor. 1, Andrew Jackson, served as a military governor in Florida before it was a state. 16 presidents previously served as U.S. senators. 16 out of 44 were U.S. senators. Only 3 immediately before election as president. Only 1 president, Andrew Jackson, served as a senator after his presidency. 14 presidents previously served as vice president. All except Richard Nixon were vice presidents immediately before becoming president. 9 of the 14 succeeded to the presidency because of the death or resignation of the elected president. 5 of those 9 were not reelected. 8 presidents were out of office for at least 1 year immediately before election as president. 8 presidents previously served as cabinet secretaries. 6 as Secretary of State. 5 of the 8 immediately served before election as president. 7 presidents had previous experience in foreign service. 6 presidents had never been elected to public office before becoming president, and these include George Washington, Zachary Taylor, U.S. Grant, Herbert Hoover, Dwight Eisenhower, and Donald Trump. Of those, Donald Trump is the only one who had no prior service to the nation. 5 presidents taught at a university. These were James Garfield, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Clinton, and Barack Obama. 2 presidents served as party leaders of the House of Representatives. These were James Garfield and Gerald Ford. 1 president was an ordained minister, and that is James Garfield. 1 served as Speaker of the House of Representatives, James K. Polk. 1 served as President pro tem of the Senate, that was John Tyler. 1 served as a party leader in the United States Senate, that was Lyndon Johnson, who was the majority leader. 1 president served as the President of the United States for 2 non-consecutive terms, that was Grover Cleveland. 1 president had neither prior public service nor military experience before becoming president, and that was Donald J. Trump. So here we have a nice synthesis, a summary of the prior experience of presidents before assuming office. In modern times, there is a predominance of Southerners becoming president. Since 1952, 6 of 12 presidents have come from the South. These are Eisenhower, Johnson, Carter, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush. And in particular, George H.W. and George W. Bush were actually born elsewhere. They were born in the North, but they were from Texas when they ran for the presidency. You might ask, well, why so many Southerners in recent times? The answer to that is likely due to strategy. With the southern states really being needed for accession to the presidency. And so you have a dominance then of Southerners in the White House. This is particularly true starting with Carter, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush. In the era when there was a transformation from Southern Democrats to Republicans, the votes of Southern states became a necessary requisite. And we're not going to go here, but there's a Wikipedia link that I've got listed here that has the presidents listed by their home states. Presidents generally had poorer health than the general population. They've had more ailments while in office, and they have generally died at a younger age. For example, Roosevelt had polio. Eisenhower had multiple heart attacks, one of which had him in the hospital for quite some time during his tenure as president. Kennedy had nerve problems. He had Addison's disease as well as back conditions. Johnson had a heart condition and kidney ailments. Reagan had bouts of cancer while he was in office. George H.W. Bush, Bush 1, had a hyperthyroid condition. And of course, Clinton was oversexed, but he had no heart ailments. George W. Bush, he had foot and mouth disease. And then finally, Trump had tweeditis and likely psychiatric issues. More generally, you can go to the link that I have here, and you can see the prior medical history of all of our past presidents, starting with George Washington. We won't go there. We'll leave that to you to do. There's a gender and racial bias for those holding the presidency. No woman has yet acceded to the presidency. There's only been one African American in American history who has acceded to the presidency, and no Hispanics have been president. Also, there's a religious bias. The bias is toward having Protestant presidents. One Roman Catholic president, that was John Kennedy, and no Jewish presidents. Many of our presidents have been Freemasons, and we have a Wikipedia entry here giving us the list of Freemason presidents. Let's go there just briefly, see if our internet is cooperating. Yes, here we are. You can see that Washington, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, James Garfield, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Warren Harding, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Jerry Ford are listed as definitely members of Freemasonry. And if we go back to our lecture, you'll see that that link omits Jefferson and Madison, two of our early presidents, as well as Lyndon Johnson, for certainty reasons. If you go to the hot links that I've got here for Jefferson and Madison, you will see that there's abundant amount of evidence that both Jefferson and Madison were Freemasons. It's just that Wikipedia can't identify what lodge they were a member of. And Lyndon Johnson was an apprentice Mason who never completed his initiation rites. And so he was a first degree Freemason and didn't go any further. Nevertheless, he was a Freemason. And so we have a number of presidents who were a member of the Masonic order. Why does that make a difference? Well, as we noted earlier, there was an anti-Masonic party early in America. The records seem to suggest that being a Freemason was a requisite for becoming president during the 19th century. And many of our presidents in the 20th century have been Freemasons. And so that seems to be an important aspect of becoming president, at least in earlier times. Religion. Here's a link to the religious affiliations of all the presidents. Note before we go there that most early presidents were Episcopalian in name, but they were actually deists. Many had no religious affiliation prior to leaving office. And so let's go to the Wikipedia link on religious affiliation of the different presidents. And let's just go down to the table. Note before we go there, though, that we have an entire link dealing with deism and the founding fathers, as well as Unitarianism and the non-religious presidents. But let's arrange these if we can by, I would like to arrange these by date. Yeah, let's arrange them by date. There we go. So you can see that George Washington was an Episcopalian. John Adams was perhaps Unitarian. and non-Trinitarian, and he doesn't have a specific denomination. Thomas Jefferson, no religion. He was raised as an Anglican, but he was actually a deist, as you see over here on the right-hand side. James Madison, Episcopalian. James Monroe, Episcopalian. And we keep going here. We have Martin Van Buren, Reformed Church in America. William Henry Harrison, Episcopalian. We get to James K. Polk. He was a Methodist, and the first of the modern religions that well, that's not the way to say it, but he was the first of the religions that are common in modern America. Episcopalian was Zachary Taylor. Episcopalian, Franklin Pierce. Presbyterian, James Buchanan. Abraham Lincoln was raised as a Reformed Baptist. And so he was the second president that we had who was associated with modern religious denominations. Andrew Jackson, no affiliation to any church. He did attend Catholic services, but he wasn't really a member of a Catholic church. U.S. Grant, Methodist. Rutherford Hayes, Presbyterian and Methodist. James Garfield, Churches of Christ. He was formerly a member of the Disciples of Christ before it split into the Disciples of Christ and the Churches of Christ. And that's no relationship to the modern Church of Christ. Chester Arthur, Episcopalian. Grover Cleveland, Presbyterian. Benjamin Harrison, Presbyterian. William McKinley, Episcopal. Theodore Roosevelt, Reformed Church in America. Okay, let's just stop there for a minute and note that of the presidents that we've seen in the 18th and 19th century here, there is a predominance of presidents who are Episcopalian or Presbyterian, with very few presidents being something else from that. What does this imply? It implies that religious fundamentalism, religious rightness, as in the term the religious right, was not a factor in the 19th century. There was no 19th century president who was a member of what they would call a radical denomination. Okay, let's move forward here. You can see in the 20th century, we have Teddy Roosevelt, Reformed Church of America. William Howard Taft, no affiliation. Woodrow Wilson, Presbyterian. And then finally we get to Warren Harding, who is a Northern Baptist. Northern Baptists are much less fundamentalist than Southern Baptists are. Calvin Coolidge, Congregationalist. Franklin Roosevelt, Episcopalian. Harry Truman, again, Northern Baptist. And Dwight Eisenhower, Presbyterian. Finally, John Kennedy, Catholic. Lyndon Johnson, Disciples of Christ, though not a very religious person. Richard Nixon, raised in an evangelical Friends affiliated church. In other words, he was a Quaker. Jerry Ford, Episcopalian. Finally, we get to Jimmy Carter, who was a Southern Baptist, and Ronald Reagan, who was Presbyterian. George Bush, Episcopalian. Bill Clinton, Southern Baptist. George Bush, United Methodist. And Barack Obama, various churches, including the United Church of Christ, and various, while he was in the White House, he attended various denominations for their services. Finally, Donald Trump, Presbyterian. So you see through all of American history, there is a predominance of mainstream churches such as Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and far fewer presidents have been what you would call fundamentalists or religious right types. Catholicism is the largest denomination in the US, and yet there's only been one Catholic president. Al Smith, who was a Catholic, ran for president in 1928 and was defeated by the largest electoral vote margin in American history and the second largest popular vote margin. Smith was the first Democrat to lose the deeply Democratic and Protestant South. And in fact, in this election, what we saw is people voting solely on the basis of Al Smith's Catholicism. People in the South were especially offended by the prospect of having a president in the White House who was a Catholic. And yet Catholicism is the largest denomination in the U.S., as I said. So there is a bias toward having presidents who are Protestant. John Kennedy, also Catholic, won against Richard Nixon in 1960 by the slimmest of margins. I was alive in 1960 and remember the 1960 presidential election. His Catholicism was a major issue in that campaign, as people would ask whether they really wanted to have a Catholic in the president, because a Catholic in the presidency would be obedient to the Pope rather than a servant of the American people. And that was clearly an attitude that people were registering in 1960. Of course, I was a child during this era, but I remember it distinctly. What difference do all of these demographic characteristics make? Now, we've talked about economic status, we've talked about religion, Freemasonry, we've talked about health conditions and so forth. So what difference do all of those things make? Some people would argue that they are the building blocks of personality. That may be, but it's not very scientific to say that Nixon had problems in the presidency because he grew up in poverty, or that Nixon had problems with his sexuality because he grew up in a single parent home. How do you know that's why he had problems? So again, it's not very scientific to utilize these aspects as a way of predicting personality issues and personality problems while a president is in office. It may be that demographic characteristics affect the president's ability to lead. For example, some people might argue that there's a bias toward viewing men as leaders and women as followers. Now, what's the evidence for that? Well, there is the Bible. Women obey your husbands. There is history. If we look at all of recorded history, we'll see that that is dominated by men, the kings of England. You did have Queen Elizabeth and the current Queen Elizabeth, but other than those, we've had very few. You also had Queen Mary, but you had very few women as leaders in not only in England, but in the United States and other countries around the world. So history seems to suggest that women are relegated to the position of being followers. I know there are women in this class, and I suspect that that would rub a woman the wrong way. I know it would really rub my wife the wrong way, and also my daughter the wrong way. And so, nevertheless, it's something to think about rationally. I just toss it out there. Does race affect the ability to lead? I have two links here concerning articles on race and the ability to lead. Let's go to the first one. Okay, so this is a scholarly article. Think Leader, Think White: Capturing and Weakening the Implicit Pro-White Leadership Bias. And we've got an abstract here. Across 4 studies, we found evidence for an implicit pro-white leadership bias that helps explain the underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in leadership positions. Both white majority and ethnic majority participants reacted significantly faster when ethnically white names and leadership roles were mentioned, or leadership traits were paired in an implicit association test, rather than when ethnic minority names and leadership traits were paired. And so I'll let you read this article on your own, but basically it summarizes the scholarly literature on the relationship between race and attitudes toward leadership. And so this is an article that is in the National Center for Biotechnology Information journal. And so I would encourage you to look at that if you're interested in the scholarly research on leadership and race. There's another article here that we won't go to, but I encourage you to. And basically, it's just another review of literature on the relationship between people's thinking about race and leadership. So all of these background factors lead us to think about the psychological aspects of the presidency, psychological orientations. Personality is an important influence on how the White House is run. Personality affects the occupant of the White House's control orientation. How much do they need to be in control? The degree of involvement of the president in White House activities. Some presidents are less actively involved. For example, Reagan was less actively involved in White House activities than, say, Carter, who was deeply involved in White House activities. Also, personality affects the organization of the White House. How hierarchical is the organization of the White House? How decentralized is the organization of the White House? The president determines these things. And finally, personality affects the willingness of the occupant of the White House to listen to advice. For example, we can think about Reagan. Reagan was very anxious to listen to advice. As a passive president, he was not particularly active day to day in the activities of the president. He did rely on his staff in order to provide him with advice. We might contrast Reagan with Trump, and Reagan appears unwilling, almost totally unwilling to, Trump rather, is almost totally unwilling to listen to advice, preferring to take on the White House activities and responsibilities fully as a person, especially through the tweet mechanism. Political psychologists, and we do have a field in political science called political psychology. So Fred Greenstein, who works in this area, outlined the conditions under which we might expect personal factors to affect the impact of presidents. He noted that the president's ability to restructure the environment is important. The president and restructuring the environment, if the president can restructure the environment that he's working in, then that enables personality to become more important. For example, presidential personality may affect the organization and design of the White House staff, and the president, of course, can readily alter that. Who does the president want to talk to? Who does the president not want to talk to? Who does the president want to talk to most and least? These are important aspects of organizing the White House staff. The location of the president relative to the rest of the executive branch. The president's ability to lead depends on structure. Sitting at the top of the executive branch is an advantage, but not uniformly so. The president may have an easier time controlling an executive agency than an independent agency. Under that circumstance, the ability to persuade becomes more important. So location, then, is important to the president's ability to lead. Personal strengths and weaknesses are important in terms of the impact of presidential personality. Things like intellect, how smart is the president, speaking skills, can the president speak off the cuff? Can the president speak in a relaxed and soothing manner? Or alternatively, does the president really need to read, say, from a speech or a teleprompter? The individual who is good at speaking tends to exert greater influence personality-wise on the success of the presidency. Another factor is integrity. Is the president perceived as somebody who is honest and has a lot of integrity. And then there's the factor of leadership. Is the president perceived as a leader, or has the president come from a background in which he or she is subservient? And finally, reputation affects the president's ability to succeed. A good example there of reputation is Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, while he was in the Senate as Senate Majority Leader, had a reputation as somebody who could get things done, and he had a reputation also of somebody who would hurt you if you didn't go along with the Senate Majority Leader's position. He carried over with him to the presidency an ability to intimidate people. And so reputation affects the president's ability to succeed. Another factor that Greenstein points out is situational ambiguity. Situational ambiguity affects when personality is important. So what he means here is when a situation is new or uncertain, presidents have more opportunity for personality to affect the situation. Situations that are new are often ambiguous. For example, Kennedy's response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, or that was brand new, never happened, anything like that happened before, or George W. Bush's response to September the 11th. Again, very new and very uncertain. Ambiguity can also arise when a situation is extremely complex. For example, with Kennedy versus the military and the bureaucracy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ambiguity may also arise when there are conflicting perspectives. For example, George W. Bush faced, on the one hand, a need for homeland security, on the other hand, right to privacy and civil liberties, matters that were traditionally espoused by libertarians, and libertarians tend to be Republican. So he's fighting his own party there. When we evaluate the effect of personality, we have to ask ourselves whether there are circumstances present that allow the person to have an impact. And see, especially the work that we looked at earlier by Steve Skowronek. And remember, Steve is suggesting that there is such a thing as political time. And in political time, the president has more ability to succeed when the environment is favorable than when the environment is unfavorable. And again, you can look back at the earlier stuff that we did concerning Steve Skowronek's categorization of political time into 4 groups. Political scientist James David Barber is probably the best known political psychologist. He did comparative presidency work, and his work is and has been seminal in the literature on the impact of the president's personality. He developed psychological profiles of all the presidents, and he sought to explain presidential performance and behavior in terms of those psychological profiles. There were 3 elements to Barber's characterization of presidential personality. First, Barber described an element of the psychological profile that he called character. Character is the way the president orients himself toward life. It includes the president's self-esteem and the pleasure that the president takes in meeting challenges. It encompasses the president's openness to criticism. How does the president feel about himself? Do they like themselves? Thinking rationally under criticism and stress. Does the president respond in a positive way, in a beneficial way to criticism or to stressful conditions? The attitude the president holds toward learning the job. These are things that Barber claims develops early in life during childhood. And there are things that are very difficult to change later in life once a pattern has developed. And what Barber argues is that character colors both the president's style and worldview, but it doesn't determine them directly. And so the other two features of Barber's elements of presidential personality are style and worldview. So let's look at style. According to Barber, style is the way the president goes about doing what the office requires him to do. It is the president's habitual way of doing things. Things like whether or not the president relies on rhetoric or personal relations or homework while doing the job. Style refers to the president's ability to speak directly to the media, to the public, to large audience. In other words, to deal face to face with people and with other politicians. The president's ability to read, write, and calculate by himself in order to manage the endless flow of details. Barber argues that style is a predictable mechanism that explains how the president deals with people, with tasks, and with communicating. So the second feature, style, Barber argues is a function of character. These are interrelated with one another, but they're not completely determined by character. Finally, the third aspect of Barber's psychological profiles was the president's worldview. Worldview concerns how the president sees the world and his lasting opinions about what he sees. These are the primary politically relevant beliefs that the president holds, particularly his conceptions of social causality, human nature, and the central moral conflicts of the time. Thinking about social causality, what causes poverty would be an example. What does the president think causes poverty? Is poverty a function of a structural flaw in the economic system that biases outcomes toward particular groups? Are some groups disadvantaged by the economic system as a structural matter? Or alternatively, social causality for the president might involve an idea that the president has that poor people are lazy. They're simply poor because they're too lazy to get out and do the work. So we have two competing views of social causality. One view would be that laziness is important. The other view is that the system is biased against certain groups. Or the second aspect of the president's worldview, human nature. What is the president's view of human nature? Are the people who are part of our world, are they intrinsically good or are they intrinsically bad? Are they inherently like what was depicted in William Golding's Lord of the Flies? Many of you will have read Golding's Lord of the Flies, and basically the argument in the Lord of the Flies is that people are inherently bad, and that without the constraints of society, they will in turn do bad things. Constraining societies produce better behavior, is the argument. Or alternatively, does the president think that people are intrinsically good? Are they humanitarian in their outlook? Do they want to do good things? And then finally, Barber's idea of worldview pertains to the central moral conflicts of the time. How does the president feel about these central moral conflicts? What are the central moral conflicts of our current time? Our current time, certainly one high on the list would be attitudes toward abortion, whether or not someone is pro-life or pro-choice would be a central moral conflict of our time. What would have been a central moral conflict of Abraham Lincoln's time? Obviously, the central moral conflict would have been whether the attitude of the president toward slavery, where Abraham Lincoln's prior predecessor, James Buchanan, was pro-slavery, and Abraham Lincoln himself was an abolitionist. And so in conclusion then, Barber constructs these psychological profiles of presidents based on evaluating their character, evaluating their style, and evaluating their worldview. And he does this by looking at the documentary record associated with each president. As you can imagine, this was really, really hard work and took a long time to do by Barber. And he didn't always get it right, as you're going to see later. Barber argues that presidential character conditions the processing of information, the consideration of options in the decision-making process, and the actual making of decisions by presidents. Presidential style, he argues that presidents set the tone for their White House, whether it's going to be formal or informal, consensual or promotive of diverse viewpoints, hierarchical or decentralized. Some presidents have a desire to dominate. I list here as examples Johnson and Nixon. I should perhaps add to that list Trump. Some presidents hate conflict. For example, Ronald Reagan was well known to really dislike conflict and try to surround himself with a consensual policy community in the White House. Some presidents have to be involved in almost everything in the White House. And Jimmy Carter was known for this to a fault because he wanted to micromanage everything. And this, of course, was inefficient. Other presidents are extremely detached from the details of the office. Reagan is an example there to a fault because he didn't have command of the details, and he was also too dependent on his advisors. And of course, that came back to haunt him late in his administration with the Iran-Contra affair, when his advisors allegedly engaged in activities that were illegal, violating the law pertaining to providing aid to the Nicaraguan Contras. Worldviews. Presidents bring to office a set of beliefs about politics, policy, human nature, and causality. In other words, their beliefs about how the world works. These affect a frame of reference and serve as a filter for processing information and also setting the potential boundaries of action. And they even supply an approach to decision-making itself. And so Barber claims that worldviews are important for presidents. His framework seems logical, to me anyway. Other things that Barber talks about, he talks about the power situation. What is the relative power of the president with regard to other institutions and actors? Note the similarity here between Barber's discussion of the power situation and earlier mention of Fred Greenstein's feature of the location of the president. Also, personality may have more or less impact depending on the power situation, which is precisely the same argument that was made by Fred Greenstein. The climate of expectations. What are the expectations that are placed on the president in particular situations? You could argue that George W. Bush's reaction to September the 11th was the perfect condition for a cowboy mentality to emerge. The public expected a John Wayne Act after September the 11th, and Bush was the president who was perfectly suited to provide that. In contrast, how would George W. Bush have reacted to the Iran hostage crisis? Would he have put together an invasion force, which undoubtedly would have led to the death of many more Americans during the invasion, and also probably the death of the 52 hostages that were being held in Tehran. So Bush's response to the Iran hostage crisis would likely have been different than that of Jimmy Carter reacted to the Iran hostage crisis. According to Barber, then, the three psychological components of style, character, and worldview comprise a pattern of motives, habits, and beliefs that result in behaviors that are evident throughout life. They're a psychological foundation that are not easily changed. Once they develop, they tend to persist. Barber develops a typology of presidents based on two concepts. And by the way, this is the most famous aspect of Barber's work. One concept that he notes is the president's activity levels. The other is the president's affective orientations. What are these things? Activity levels are the energy that presidents bring to the job. Are they really, really vigorous in pursuing the work of the presidency, or are they pretty laid back in pursuing the work of the presidency? The affective orientation is the level of pleasure that the president obtains from doing the job. Does the president seem to really like doing the job of the White House? So he characterizes presidents based on their activity levels and their affective orientations. Note that both are laid out on a continuum. An active passive dimension describes activity levels on a continuum. From one end, we have passive. On the far other end, we have active. So we have active, passive dimension using Barber's typology. Also, there is a positive and negative dimension that describes the president's affective orientation toward the work. On the positive dimension, we have a president who really, really, really enjoys doing the work. On the negative dimension, we have a president who really he abhors doing the work. And so Barber's active negative dimension describes the other dimension. You can think of this as being an active passive dimension on a left-right continuum, and the affective orientations being present on a top-bottom continuum. So here's Barber's characteristic associated with active positive, active negative, and passive positive and passive negative presidents. He states the active positive president is adaptive. He says this presidential type is characteristic of an energetic president who enjoys his work and who tends to be productive and capable of adapting to new situations. Such a person generally feels confident and good about himself. And then he gives examples from his psychological profiles that are constructed of the presidents historically. He argues that examples of adaptive and active positive presidents are Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John Kennedy, Jerry Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, and Obama. Note here that there's a significant number of Republicans among this group. So he is not necessarily biased in one direction or another with regard to his characterization, though others have criticized it as being biased in the liberal direction. Active negative presidents, Barber describes these individuals as compulsive. This personality type describes a president who works very hard, but does not gain a lot of pleasure from working hard, and who tends to be intense, compulsive, and aggressive. He may pursue his public actions in a self-interested manner. Such a person generally feels insecure and uses the position to overcome those feelings of inadequacy and even impotence. From Barber's historical work, he provides the examples of active negative presidents as Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, Herbert Hoover, a Republican, Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, Richard Nixon, a Republican, and George W. Bush, a Republican. So the active negative president is less suited to the presidency. Next, we have the passive positive presidents. Barber describes the passive positive presidents as compliant in their personality type. He argues that this personality type describes a relatively receptive, laid-back individual who wants to gain agreement and mute dissent at all costs. This person is apt to feel pessimistic and unloved at a deep psychological level. As president, the passive positive individual attempts to compensate for these negative feelings by being overly optimistic and by continually trying to elicit agreement and support from others. Barber's historical analysis gives examples. His examples are James Madison, an early Democratic Republican, an early Democratic Republican president, Howard Taft, a Republican, Warren G. Harding, Republican, and then finally Ronald Reagan, he says, fits this category. Finally, the passive negative personality type he describes as being withdrawn. He argues that this personality type can be said to really hate politics and to withdraw from interpersonal relationships. This person, according to Barber, is ill-suited for political office, much less the nation's highest office. He or she suffers from low self-esteem and a sense of uselessness and is apt to take refuge in generalized principles and standard procedures. And he characterizes three presidents in this category. The first is George Washington, the second is Calvin Coolidge, and then the third is Eisenhower. Just as a side note there, he, in his original work, characterized Eisenhower as passive negative. Later, in a revised version of his work, he altered his categorization of Eisenhower and recategorized him as active positive. Barber retired around the time of the Clinton presidency, that is in the late 1990s, and he died a few years later in 2004, so he did not rate later presidents than the Clinton presidency. But there have been others who have used his typology to rate other presidents. What was Clinton? Barber rated Clinton as an active positive in his revised work, his later work. John Dean is a scholar in this area who has rated Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and as we're going to see in a few minutes, Donald J. Trump. And I have here linked an article to John Dean's publications, and this came out in 2012, which is in the middle of the Obama presidency. But just as a short here, he rated Clinton as active positive, George W. Bush as active negative, and Barack Obama as active positive. What is Trump? He's also written about Trump, and he did it early on. This is in May of 2017. He did it early on to predict Donald Trump's presidency. And if you read the article here, you will discover that he did a pretty good job based on personality in predicting what would occur and become of Donald Trump's presidency. Barber's work and the work of other political psychologists has been critiqued. Some of the critiques, one of them is that classifying presidents using Barber's scheme is highly subjective, and the classification may result from confounding factors. For example, Eisenhower is classified by Barber as passive negative. He was clearly a passive president, but how do you know that this was a function of personality rather than ideology? Ike believed in less government. Could it be that he was passive so as not to have to have an activist presidency due to his ideology? Barber actually changed his mind about Eisenhower in later work, as I suggested a little while ago. Barber's scheme may also be too simplistic. Presidents may vary on continua from active to passive and positive to negative, and they can lie anywhere in the middle of those continuums. They can be neither active nor passive, right, if they sit right in the middle of that continuum, or they could be neither positive nor negative if they sit in the middle of the continuum that runs in the top-bottom direction from positive to negative. And so why try to place presidents in discrete cells as Barber did? Some presidents may be hyperactive. Clinton is probably an example. Other presidents may just be active without the expenditure of frenetic energy. For example, Kennedy and FDR would be examples who certainly don't fit at the extremes of the active passive dimension. They would probably fit somewhere near the middle of the active passive dimension. And so Barber's scheme may be too simplistic using a four-cell typology. Probably better to characterize presidents somewhere along the two continua rather than putting them all at the extremes of the continuum. Also, it's not so easy to classify presidents as positive or negative. Clinton was classified by Barber as positive. He enjoyed politics. Clinton relished the work of the presidency, and he was a very public person. On the other hand, he reacted very negatively to attacks from the media and the continual criticisms that came from the right wing of the Republican Party during his presidency. Barber claims that the active positive makes the best president. However, not all active positives have been good presidents. Witness, for example, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, and William J. Clinton, none of whom are characterized as great presidents, as you're going to see in a little while. Likewise, there have been some presidents who were active negative who were characterized as great presidents. For example, Woodrow Wilson and Abraham Lincoln. So thinking about presidential greatness, here we get into a really subjective area, thinking about presidential greatness. Commonly, historians have developed rankings of presidential greatness based on polls of historians. And this practice was begun by Arthur Schlesinger Sr. In the 1940s. And it continues to now, as you're going to see in a little while. The most highly ranked presidents are consistently Washington, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Harry Truman. A more objective approach is taken by the C-SPAN rankings. The criteria for evaluation using the C-SPAN rankings are public persuasion, relations with Congress, international relations, economic management, administrative skills, moral authority, crisis leadership, vision and agenda setting, performance within the context of the times, and then finally pursued equal justice for all. Question, on a scale from 1 to 10, how would you rank Donald Trump on each of these criteria? So looking back at the criteria, is he good at public persuasion? Probably not. How good are his relations with Congress? Right now, not very good. International relations, he has alienated much of the international community. Economic management, probably better than average, though not as good as he would argue it is. Administrative skills, he doesn't seem to get along very well with his administration. Moral authority, he doesn't exercise a lot of moral authority. Crisis leadership, gauges leadership during the coronavirus crisis. Vision and agenda setting, probably not very high. Performance in the context of the times, probably less than average. Pursued equal justice for all, probably not very much at all. So Donald Trump would not rank very high on the scale from 1 to 10, at least my assessment of Trump would be very low on this scale. This is very subjective, though. You might rank him higher than I would. A variety of polls have been conducted through the years based largely on public opinion. Does that imply a bias? Is the public biased in their opinion polls? Simonton, a scholar studying in this area, tried to get around the political bias problem by using some purely objective indicators. His indicators are length of service, whether they are a wartime presidency, an assassinated president, whether they had scandal during their administration, whether they are a war hero prior to entering office, and finally, their intellectual brilliance. So again, how would you rank Donald J. Trump on each of these 6 dimensions? We don't know yet on length of service. Is he a wartime president? Yes. We're still in the Afghanistan war, not fully out. Is he an assassinated president? No. Has there been scandal? Yes. Was he a war hero prior to entering office? No, he was not even in the military prior to entering office. Intellectual brilliance, there's room for debate and discussion on his intellectual brilliance. If he is the person who is classifying his own intellectual brilliance, he is the stable genius that he claims to be. Others might disagree about his intellectual brilliance. Okay, so let's look at the various rankings that have been done of presidential greatness. Wikipedia, my standby on sources, has done a ranking of presidents in terms of their greatness, and you can see from the Wikipedia article here that there are notable scholar surveys, scholar survey results, the Murray Blessing 1982 survey, public opinion polls, Rasmussen, Gallup, public opinion polls on recent presidents, and so forth. So let's go to the rankings themselves. And in these rankings, blue backgrounds indicate that the president is in the first quartile. Green backgrounds indicate that the president is in the second quartile. Orange indicate the third quartile, and finally red indicates the fourth quartile. So you can see here that George Washington is all blue among all of these rankings of presidential greatness. Thomas Jefferson is also all blue among all of these rankings. Andrew Jackson is consistently blue in all of these rankings, though sometimes he is green, which is in the second quartile. Paging down through here, we see that Abraham Lincoln was all blue. We see that Franklin Roosevelt was all blue. Harry Truman was mostly blue with one green, second quartile. Dwight Eisenhower is significantly blue, but with 2 greens and 1/3 quartile in this layout. John Kennedy was not a great president, according to what we have here. He was second quartile. And Ronald Reagan had a lot of blue among these surveys, but he is not ranked as one of the great presidents. We can rank the presidents according to their presidential greatness by looking at the most frequent quartile. And so we rearrange this, and you can see that the greatest presidents were George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower. And then Ronald Reagan is a step below those presidents in these rankings of presidential greatness. So I invite you to study the rankings of presidents and look at the rankings in terms of greatness. And we can rearrange this last column, by the way. to see who the worst presidents were. According to this ranking set, you can see that William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, U.S. Grant, and Warren G. Harding are ranked very, very low by scholars and the public. And of course, we don't have data in yet on Donald J. Trump, but the two studies that we have so far put him in the fourth quartile. We have to wait a few years until we get more data on Donald J. Trump for that ranking. Okay, as you can see, we have once again reached the end of our prepared lecture slides. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and talk to you directly. During this lecture session, we have talked about the psychological aspects of the presidency. Early on in the course, when I talked about the ways we have of studying the presidency, one of the major ways that we study the presidency is through this psychological approach. There are not a lot of political scientists who use this approach to studying the presidency, and I've highlighted the most prominent historically who have studied the presidency from this psychological presidency orientation. In this session, we have talked about the backgrounds of the various presidents, as well as their status economically, their status socially. We noted that 10 of our prior presidents have had other family members in the presidency. And of course, that suggests a sort of an elite system where you have to know someone or someone in your family is influential in you becoming president. So it suggests an elite orientation to the American presidency. Finally, we concluded this lecture with a discussion of the psychological typologies, Greenstein's characterization of what allows personality to be important in conducting the presidency. And then finally, we talked about the characterization and categorization by James David Barber, his classification of multiple presidents. And then we also looked a little bit about the critiques that have been offered by Barber, offered of Barber. Okay, so this concludes our single session on presidential personality. Next, we're going to talk about the presidency as an institution. The presidency as an institution suggests an orientation that is neo-institutional or institutional. The idea being that personality is not the only thing that is important to the conduct of the presidency. Rather, presidents are constrained and are embedded in a framework that determines presidential actions. Okay, we will stop there and conduct that next lecture in due time. Have a nice afternoon, and thank you for listening.